Chapter 3. Sophia looked up. The sun was indeed shining. There were clouds in the sky, but not the heavy solid clouds of earlier that morning. These were puffier and broken up. In fact, there was as much clear sky as there were clouds, and the sun was almost directly overhead. Ya Rabbi, Sophia thought in Arabic. What time is it? How long was I unconscious? And why haven't my parents found me? Sophia listened intently. The sound of the river rushing by was unbroken, although it wasn't rushing as fast here as it had been upstream, because the riverbed was wider. She listened for several seconds. She heard birds and insects from behind her, but no sirens or choppers. Sophia wondered if she should look in her backpack and see if her other clothes had gotten wet. Maybe, if she was lucky, they would be dry, since the backpack was leather. Leather was waterproof, wasn't it? Cows' insides didn't get wet. When she found herself thinking about cows' insides, she decided she needed to do something to keep busy. Even though she held out little hope that her things were dry, going through her backpack to check the condition of her stuff would keep her occupied until the rescue people or her parents arrived. First things first, though, Sophia needed to get her hand bandaged up. Now that the adrenaline was gone, it was really beginning to throb. The scrapes were deeper than she'd thought at first. Sophia ventured back to the river's edge. She didn't want to get near the water again, but she had to wash out those cuts so they didn't get infected. She squatted down about a foot from the water and stuck her hand out. She knew the water was far from sanitary, but it was the only water around, so she went ahead and sloshed her hand around for several seconds in the river. When she withdrew it, it looked a bit cleaner, so she headed back up the slope so she could put antibiotic ointment and Band-Aids on her scrapes. Then Sophia sank to the ground in her sunny spot and opened her backpack. She started with the main compartment. The only water that had gotten in had come from around the zipper at the top. Wow, cows' insides really do stay dry, she said aloud, and smiled for the first time since her ordeal. The nausea hadn't come back again, and Sophia didn't feel inordinately sleepy, so she allowed herself to think that maybe she didn't have a concussion after all. Her fingers shook from cold, and she prayed her clothes would be dry enough to wear. Each little breeze that came along went straight to her bones, the same breezes that she'd been thankful for earlier that day. The worst casualties of the accident were the new pink flats she'd packed to wear with her skirt, which were at the very top. They were soaked, and the padding was already coming off from the soles. Her first aid kit was next. She regretted bringing it earlier because it added extra weight to her backpack, but she sure was glad for her foresight now. The kit and the prayer rug underneath it were pretty wet. She looked inside the first aid kit and was relieved to find that the itch cream, antibiotic ointment, Tylenol, bandages, gauze, alcohol wipes, and tape inside were safe and dry. Even her mom's Benadryl was still dry, as it was packed in individual foil-wrapped compartments. Thankfully, the most important item in the kit, her EpiPen, was also undamaged. After her bout with the bee as a child, she'd had allergy tests that showed she was allergic to bees and shellfish. Shellfish were usually pretty easy to avoid, especially in Kansas, but bees did not always understand the avoidance concept. So whenever she was going to be outdoors, she had to carry the pen, which was actually a small syringe filled with epinephrine, to stick herself with in case of a sting. The doctor said another sting like the one when she was small might result in anaphylactic shock and even death before she would be able to get to the hospital. The pen was her lifeline. Sophia took out a bandage and the antibiotic ointment and dressed her palm. Then she took the prayer rug out and found the beige peasant skirt and blouse she'd packed in case her family went out to eat with their cousins. Her pink and beige flower print scarf was folded neatly inside the skirt. The extra clothes were a bit damp, but certainly more dry than what she had on. Sophia left her backpack where it was and picked her way carefully up to the trees. There was undergrowth and shrubbery everywhere. She ducked behind a large bush to change, being careful not to judge any leaves because she wasn't exactly sure what poison ivy looked like. She considered leaving her feet bare since she didn't have any shoes anyway, but went ahead and put on her clean socks because her feet were so cold, and at least they afforded some protection from the rocks and twigs. Once out of her wet clothes and into her mostly dry skirt and top, Sophia immediately felt warmer. Back at her backpack, she spread her wet clothes and prayer rug out on the ground to dry. Bending over to do so made her head throb, and she felt her sore spot again. It was the size of a small egg. Sophia wished she could at least put some ice on it. She improvised with one of her wet socks and sat down carefully to finish going through her things. At the very bottom of her backpack, she found a small photo album she had packed to show her cousin. Still dry, alhamdulillah. It held the pictures that Sophia and Amani had taken during the last month of school. Sophia's cousin, Tasneem, had lived in Leawood before her dad had gotten a job in Lawrence, and she really missed the girls at Sophia's school. Sophia had brought the album to share with her. She flipped through it quickly and set it aside. The compass, pens, and toiletries in the outside pocket had all gotten wet, but wouldn't suffer any permanent damage. She set them aside with her photo album and then opened her backpack to the sun. Once that was done, though, she didn't know what else to do. Sophia estimated that at least 20 minutes had gone by since she had crawled out of the river. She was working hard to swallow the terror that threatened to rise up from her chest. What if her parents didn't find her? Sophia wondered how weak her immune system would get from being so cold and wet. She could come down with pneumonia, or her hand could become infected and she could lose it to gangrene. A small spider crawled across her prayer rug, and this presented Sophia with a new worry. Spiders and snakes! And leeches! She'd been in the water for she didn't know how long. Sophia began to check her scalp and skin for hitchhikers. When she didn't find any, she calmed down a little. The moment of terror passed, and she realized she needed to take some steps to find out what her situation was and how she might be able to get out of it herself if help didn't come in time. She decided to venture through the bushes and past the small stand of trees behind them that lined the bank. This was not as easy as she'd expected it to be. Between her throbbing head and her tender stalking feet, she had to pick her way slowly through the trees. She was rewarded for all this effort by a huge expanse of tall, wavy, light green grass that began just beyond the trees. Must be some kind of hayfield, she thought. I must really have been swept past the bike trail. Sophia trekked back through the trees and sat back down by her backpack. Looking at the racing water, she waited. The river rushed by, but didn't offer her any answers in its hurry. She decided that when her things dried a bit, she would set up upstream, back toward where she assumed the bike trail began. She'd walk slowly and carefully along the bank so as not to aggravate her head injury or step on any dangerous plants. Or broken bottles. Or worse! With a start, Sophia remembered an email she had received once that warned of used syringes left by junkies in the least suspected places, like playland ball pits and sandboxes. She expected that there were probably tons of stuff like that buried just beneath the surface of the grass and sand. How had she walked all the way through the trees with no shoes on? She felt her pink flats, but they were still pretty wet. No matter, though. She would wear them wet rather than walk upriver without them. Sophia checked her clothes. Her t-shirt was starting to dry out, but her jeans were still completely soaked. She looked at the sun and found it beginning to descend. She decided that if no one had come to rescue her by the time of the afternoon prayer, about 4 p.m, when shadows were the same size as their objects, she would start walking. In the meantime, she just had to sit still and not panic. Sitting still made her realize she was starving. It was a sudden, urgent hunger, because up until then she had been preoccupied and hadn't realized she was hungry at all. I wish I hadn't fed half my protein bar to that chipmunk, she said to herself. The sound of the river and the warmth of the sun began to lull Sophia into sleepiness. She leaned back on the slope, slid her prayer rag out from underneath her toiletries, and rolled it up for a pillow. Then she eased herself down onto it. She fought sleep because she knew that people with possible concussions should not be allowed to drop off, and because she didn't want to become spider bait. But the trauma of the day had just been too much for her, and the sun was so comforting. She drifted off to sleep and stopped worrying for a couple of hours.